In this episode, we take a big step from policies and intentions into the world of controls, which are the real-world mechanisms that make privacy rules happen even when people are busy, distracted, or under pressure. Classification is the practice of labeling information based on what it is and how risky it would be if it were misused, exposed, or kept too long. Life cycle is the full journey of that information from collection to deletion, including every use, transfer, and storage point in between. Technical controls are built into systems and tools, while operational controls are built into processes, routines, and human decision-making. For brand new learners, the most important idea is that privacy outcomes do not come from good intentions alone, because data will move and grow unless something actively guides it. By learning how to design and evaluate both technical and operational controls for classification and the lifecycle, you gain a practical way to turn privacy expectations into consistent behavior that can be measured and improved. A control is a safeguard or constraint that reduces risk by preventing a problem, detecting a problem, or correcting a problem after it occurs. Preventive controls are like locked doors and clear rules that stop mistakes before they happen, while detective controls are like alarms and logs that reveal issues quickly. Corrective controls are the actions and mechanisms that help you recover, such as restoring proper access settings or deleting data that was retained too long. In privacy work, controls are used to reduce the likelihood that personal information is handled in ways that are unfair, surprising, unauthorized, or unsafe. A beginner should also understand that controls can fail in two basic ways. They can be missing, or they can exist but not operate effectively. Designing controls is about choosing the right mix for the risks you face, and evaluating controls is about confirming they work in real conditions, not just in theory. Classification is the key to making controls practical, because not all data deserves the same handling rules. If an organization treats all information as equally sensitive, employees either ignore the rules because they are too strict, or the organization spends too much effort protecting low-risk data while missing what truly matters. If an organization treats everything as low risk, then highly sensitive information ends up scattered and exposed. Classification creates a shared language that helps people and systems decide what to do next, such as who can access data, how it can be shared, and how long it should be kept. For privacy, classification often focuses on whether information can identify a person, whether it reveals sensitive details, and whether it creates significant harm if misused. When classification is well designed, it becomes the foundation for lifecycle controls, because it connects the type of data to the required handling across each stage. A common beginner misconception is that classification is only about labeling documents, but the more useful way to think about it is labeling data in motion and at rest, wherever it lives. Personal information can appear in forms, databases, logs, analytics systems, exports, and messages, and each location can create different risks. Classification also needs to be consistent across teams, because the same data element should not be treated as harmless in one department and highly restricted in another. That consistency does not happen automatically, which is why controls matter. Some classification decisions can be built into systems, such as tagging records based on their fields, while other decisions rely on people, such as recognizing when a free text note contains sensitive personal details. Designing classification controls means deciding what can be automated, what must be guided by policy and training, and what must be reviewed when ambiguity is high. When you design controls for classification, you start with the purpose of classification in your program, because different organizations classify for different outcomes. Some classify primarily to manage confidentiality risk, focusing on preventing unauthorized access. Others classify to manage privacy fairness and sensitivity, focusing on limiting certain uses and strengthening consent and transparency. Many do both, and they also include operational needs like retention scheduling, legal holds, and incident response prioritization. A well-designed classification scheme is usually simple enough that people can apply it consistently, but detailed enough to drive meaningful differences in handling. If there are too many categories, people guess or avoid labeling. If there are too few categories, labels become meaningless. Controls help by building classification into normal workflows, so people do not have to remember extra steps or invent labels on the fly. Technical controls for classification often begin with access control, because classification should influence who can see or change information. A simple idea is least privilege, meaning people should have only the access needed for their role, not a broad set of permissions just in case. Classification can also guide segmentation, where sensitive data is stored and processed in more tightly controlled environments. Another technical control is data loss prevention, which can help detect or block certain kinds of sharing, such as sending sensitive information to unauthorized destinations. Encryption is also relevant, but beginners should remember that encryption protects data from certain threats, not from every misuse, because an authorized user can still misuse decrypted data. Logging and monitoring are technical controls that support evaluation, because without records of access and transfer, you cannot reliably detect unusual patterns. The point is not to become tool-specific, but to understand that technical controls enforce rules at scale, especially when data moves quickly. Operational controls for classification often look less exciting, but they are just as important because they shape how decisions are made and how exceptions are handled. Examples include training people to recognize personal information, building review steps into project processes, and requiring documentation when a dataset is labeled in a way that changes access or retention. Operational controls also include governance routines, such as periodic audits of classification accuracy and clear ownership for classification rules. Change management is an operational control that matters because classification can drift when new products, new data sources, or new uses appear. If a team starts collecting a new kind of information and nobody updates classification guidance, the data may be handled incorrectly for months. Operational controls also include escalation paths, so when employees are unsure about a label or a sharing decision, they know exactly who can decide and how quickly. Now connect classification to the life cycle, because a label is only valuable if it drives actions across collection, use, sharing, storage, retention, and deletion. At collection time, classification controls can limit what is captured, such as discouraging sensitive details in free text fields unless truly necessary. Classification can also drive notice and consent requirements, because certain kinds of data require stronger transparency and sometimes explicit permission. During use, classification controls can restrict certain analytics or repurposing, ensuring the data is used only in ways that match the original purpose and what people would expect. During sharing, classification controls can require approvals, contract terms, or additional safeguards before data leaves a trusted boundary. During storage, classification can determine whether data must be isolated, how long it can remain active, and how tightly access must be monitored. At retention and deletion, classification can determine timelines and deletion priority, because keeping highly sensitive data longer than needed creates a disproportionate privacy risk. Designing lifecycle controls requires you to think in terms of points of control, which are the moments when a decision is made or an action occurs that changes the risk. One point of control is the decision to collect a data element, because that is when you can prevent unnecessary risk. Another point is the decision to allow a new use, such as using a dataset for a different analysis than originally planned. Another is the decision to share with a vendor, because that is when you can require safeguards and evidence of compliance. Another is the retention trigger, such as when an account closes or a contract ends, because that is when the deletion clock should start. A good set of controls covers the most important points of control, rather than trying to control everything in a way that slows down the organization. For beginners, it helps to remember that you are designing a system that nudges behavior towards safe defaults and creates friction only when risk is high. Evaluating controls is the other half of Task 4, and evaluation starts by distinguishing between control design and control operation. A control can be designed well on paper but still fail because people do not follow the process or because the system is misconfigured. Conversely, a control can be crude in design but still reduce risk if it is followed consistently, though there is usually room for improvement. Evaluation asks whether the control is present, whether it is appropriate for the risk, whether it is operating consistently, and whether it produces evidence. Evidence might include logs of access decisions, records of approvals, training completion that is paired with observed behavior improvements, or audit results that show labels are applied correctly. Evaluation also considers coverage, meaning whether the control applies to all relevant systems and teams or only a subset. A control that works perfectly in one application but is ignored in another is still a program gap that must be understood and addressed. A practical way to evaluate classification controls is to test the system's ability to answer simple but powerful questions. Can the organization identify where personal information is stored and what categories it falls into? Can it distinguish between low-risk data and high-risk data in a way that affects handling, not just labeling? Can it show that only appropriate roles access sensitive information and that access changes when roles change? Can it detect when sensitive data is shared in unexpected ways and respond quickly? If those questions cannot be answered confidently, the controls may not be working, even if policies exist. Evaluation also involves checking for false confidence, where a label exists but nobody knows how it was applied or whether it is correct. In privacy, confidence must be supported by evidence and by a realistic understanding of system complexity. Evaluating lifecycle controls also means looking for common failure patterns that appear in many organizations. One failure pattern is orphan data, where data remains in systems long after the purpose ends because no retention trigger is connected to actual events. Another failure pattern is shadow copies, where exports, backups, or temporary datasets become permanent because nobody owns cleanup. Another is uncontrolled sharing, where data moves to new teams or vendors through informal channels rather than through a consistent review process. Another is uncontrolled repurposing, where a dataset collected for one purpose is used for another because it is convenient and nobody checks whether the new use is fair and expected. When you evaluate controls, you look for these patterns as signals that governance and reality are misaligned. You also look for resilience, meaning whether the controls still work when the organization is stressed by deadlines, high turnover, or rapid growth. It is also important to understand that controls can create trade-offs, and good design recognizes those trade-offs rather than pretending they do not exist. Overly strict controls can push people to work around the system, which can increase risk in hidden ways. Overly loose controls can create a fast path for business outcomes, but leave the organization unable to explain or defend its data practices. The best controls feel proportionate, meaning they match the level of sensitivity and the likely harm. They also evolve, because the risk landscape changes when new laws appear, new threats emerge, or new products shift what data is collected. Part of evaluation is asking whether the control set can adapt, such as whether classification rules can be updated, whether training can be refreshed, and whether monitoring can be tuned as new data flows appear. Controls that cannot adapt tend to become outdated quickly, even if they were strong at the time they were created. As you bring everything together, the main lesson is that privacy outcomes depend on the combination of classification and lifecycle controls that work in both technical and operational reality. Classification tells the organization what it is handling and how risky it is, and lifecycle thinking tells the organization what should happen to that data over time. Technical controls provide scale and consistency, but operational controls provide judgment, accountability, and the ability to handle exceptions responsibly. Evaluating controls means checking not only whether they exist, but whether they operate reliably across teams and systems, and whether they produce evidence that builds trust. Task force matters because it trains you to move beyond policy language and into the mechanisms that keep privacy promises true under real conditions. When you can design and evaluate controls for classification and the lifecycle, you can help an organization reduce harm, reduce surprises, and operate in a way that is both defensible and respectful to the people behind the data.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.